welcome to Bristol Legal, where we bring you legal issues that impact you and your communities. I'm Elizabeth Nowakowski, and today I'm very excited to bring you a special guest, Congressman Joe Kennedy III. Thank you so much for joining us today. You represent the 4th Congressional District in Massachusetts.
I do.
Welcome.
Thank you. Thrilled to be here. Thanks for the invitation.
And our Fall River, far away from DC, but even so, would really appreciate you coming to see us. I wanted to start our discussion about maybe we can call it civic engagement, but a lot of people may feel frustrated with what's happening in DC. So without going into details why, there is a lot of maybe disappointment or a lot of I don't want to say distrust, but maybe I think many people feel that the executive branch is really not stable. There's a lot of instability. There's a lot of turnover, and I think many people feel powerless in terms of what's happening out there, because Washington is far away. Whether you are, in Fall River, Taunton, Boston, or anywhere else in the country, the question is, how can a person make a difference? How can a person? What would you say a person can do to get empowered and feel like they're doing something without getting involved in politics and run for an office?
So I think a couple of things. One, wherever I go, whether it's throughout the district, the 4th District in Massachusetts, the 34 cities and towns that I represent, including Fall River up to some of the suburbs of Boston, whether it's meeting with groups down in Washington, D.C. as they come to our office, or whether it's travels around the country, an awful lot of people across the political spectrum, from progressives to strong conservatives, are very frustrated with the system. And part of that is the way the system works, and it is designed to go slower than people, I think, would like. But that frustration is palpable and it's very real. So for people that want to try to channel that energy someplace, I'd say, one, that's great. And regardless of where you are across that political spectrum, again, that's exactly what our system, our country demands, and what the way that people actually live up to that responsibility of citizen engagement. So a couple ways to do it short of running for office yourself. One, it is slightly involved in politics, but not necessarily, again, mounting a campaign, is getting involved at whichever level you want to, federal, state, local, with your local parties. There's Republican parties across our Commonwealth. There's Democratic parties across the Commonwealth. There's state parties. There's local chapters of them. If you happen to have a different party affiliation, you can go online and try to find what other local manifestations there are, local representations there are, and you can join some of those efforts. You can get to know some of those parties and individuals that are powering them, so that you get a sense of kind of how that political process works. Again, short of control of the Senate or the House or the bunch of Democrats running for the presidency or support for Donald Trump, seeing how those big national themes are then represented at the local level, I think one can be one way to channel that effort and energy. Two is there's an awful lot of other local races, from my own every 2 years to every other member of the House of Representatives that has to run every 2 years, to Senate races. Senator Markey is up for re-election this year, and I know he's already started those re-election efforts, to the state and local races from state Senate, state House, and then everything from school board, town councils, all sorts of other races that matter and that are extremely important when it comes to actually delivering on, again, not necessarily these major political philosophies, but issues around how much money you're going to spend on your local school. Are you going to make an investment in a local school that's going to require property tax override? So where the rubber really meets the road for an awful lot of politics ends up being at the most local level. And a lot of times those efforts and those races don't get a whole lot of attention, but they are extremely impactful for people's daily, day-to-day lives. Last piece. Outside of the entire political spectrum, how can you get involved? One is just start looking around for local organizations, charities, nonprofits, civic engagement opportunities that are either of interest to you, whether that's on the environment, whether it's on education, whether it's on mentorship, whether it's on any other issue under the sun. There's local organizations all over our communities and throughout our country that are dedicated to trying to find the ways to either empower our neighbors or meet basic needs of folks that need to have those needs met. So organizations that end up supporting an awful lot of those other smaller organizations, like the United Way. You can call our office and ask for some list of organizations that have at least made contact with us. You can do a quick search online, Google search about whatever other causes or political causes, local community causes are out there. And I'd urge you just to get involved, go to a couple of those meetings, understand what they're all about.
Getting involved in the local government is one of the best things they can do to make a difference, because it really directly impacts their lives. I'm not saying that Washington, D.C. politics does not, but you really do see the connection, because it's your children going to school and you're talking about the budget that we
100%. And look, the issues that we deal with in Washington, whether it's the House where I am or the Senate or even the presidency, House and Senate are responsible for crafting laws and then passing them, and the oversight of laws that have already been passed. In order for a law when a law gets passed, we are talking about federal policy that's going to impact about 330 million people and the most powerful nation in the world. That system was designed, for better and worse, to be a slow, grinding process. It means that when a law does get passed, it applies to all of us. And so part of that design was then to say, hey, let's make sure it is a slow, grinding, deliberate process. When you're looking at state and local policy, it's not across 330 million people. It's across a local community. It's across a much smaller district. It's across our Commonwealth. And so those processes often move a bit more quickly, but it means that they have real, tangible impacts. The questions about how much a local community is going to be paying in property taxes and how that money then goes to affect the school budget is an issue that's going to affect people in a very real way, very quickly in terms of local taxes, but on a return for your child or your neighbor's children's education. And so those are some of these questions that are, I think, really impactful, much more immediate, that don't get the coverage across cable news or major newspapers.
But you mentioned something which will be a great segue to my second question I wanted to cover, is the legislative process in D.C. Is the whole idea of how slow it moves. And you made a point that some of it may have been intentional to make sure you really, you vet it as much as you can, because it's going to impact so many individuals. But I don't think people understand how it really. I'm not saying they don't understand how it's, whether the way it works is supposed to, is it working the way it was supposed to work? And if in the ideal world you had a bill that has bipartisan support, how long ideally should it take for it to be, to go from beginning to the end till the president signs off on it, versus how long is it taking?
So it's a great question, and unfortunately there's not a really short answer to it that does all of the complication, or all of the complexity justice. What I can say is the system itself was designed to be slow and to make sure that when a law did get passed through our lower chamber of government, the House, the upper chamber, the Senate, and then signed into law by the executive branch, the president, it was supposed to be hard enough to ensure that when it did get passed, it was actually reflective of the will of the people. And if something sped through, you'd end up getting just as bad a paralysis, arguably worse, but you just have that pendulum swing back and forth more quickly. So you'd have, say, Republicans pass a tax cut, and then if you saw political controls seesaw back the other way, have Democrats go and pass their own version of it, and have local communities, businesses, families paralyzed because they don't know what the policy is going to be the next year, let alone have any ability to plan. And so we're on the back end of that, where it was supposed to be hard to try to provide some stability and runway for people to understand how this process was going to change. I don't think it was supposed to be this difficult. The reality in Washington is that bipartisan support is critical in order to get policy passed most of the time, but it also depends on who makes up that bipartisan team. How do you build legislating at its core is about building a coalition. And it's about building a coalition of support to move a bill through Congress and then signed by the executive, signed by the president, that has a coalition behind it that is willing to come together and make the case to other members of Congress, but in our communities back home, that this is in fact the best pathway forward and is going to be in our national best interest. You have to do all of that within the construct of the House of Representatives and the Senate, where if the House of Representatives were elected for 2 years, So 2 years sounds like a fair amount of time. We are in session about half that time because the primary responsibility of our jobs is actually at home, doing constituent services, appearing on shows like this, and running around our districts, making sure that our government is serving the people that we are elected to serve. That is the number one responsibility of a member of the House, more so than passing any major law. And so half of our time is spent running around our districts, half of the time is spent in DC. And then to try to get a bill through that process, you have to draft one. It has to then be filed. It goes through a subcommittee process, a full committee process, the markup on the floor, a full vote, or markup through the committee, a full vote. It's got to get passed through the House. It's then got to go through the Senate. That same process through the Senate. If there's differences between those two bills, it's those differences then have to be worked out. That then has to be repassed again, and then off to the president for him to sign it, or her to sign it. And that reality then, to try to work that through what is essentially going to be only a year, ends up being rather difficult, particularly when you end up with issues that are as complex as healthcare, immigration. It should have been taxes, although I'd argue our Republican colleagues, there's bills that pass Congress pretty quickly that are not controversial, and they do pass pretty quickly. Naming a post office after a local hero, House resolutions that are based off of fundamental principles to American society, folks that are honoring local and national heroes. A lot of these issues they're not partisan, there's no real opposition, and we pass a number of those every week, as does the Senate, and those things move. They don't get a whole lot of attention because they're not controversial, they're pretty basic.
Exactly.
And
they're not healthcare, they're not immigration, they're not taxes.
Right.
And that's interesting because sometimes I think, unfortunately the way the media works, right? We end up focusing on the things that are not working, and we sometimes forget about all the bills and all the other work that is happening in DC that is actually...
We do, and on the one hand, from somebody in that process, that can be a bit frustrating. On the other hand, to be fair, the fact that a local community in Arkansas happened to name a local post office after somebody doesn't probably impact somebody in Massachusetts the same way as healthcare, taxes, immigration.
That's right.
And so when you do look at those major policies and aspects of our foreign policy as well, that do impact all of us, that are contentious, where people have different ideas about the role of the federal government in all of those policies, then that's where when people wonder, hey, why can't we get something done on immigration? Why can't you get something done on gun violence legislation? Why can't you get something done on healthcare? Well, the challenge ends up being there's a number of my colleagues down in Washington that feel very passionately about not doing something to try to, how I would phrase it and frame it, address the problem the way that I think it needs to be addressed. They look at it very differently, and they're dead set against doing something the way that many of them, framing that solution the way that I frame it. And so part of that effort then is, well, how do you find ways to meet in the middle and move that through? And part of the challenge at the moment is you have segments of our political spectrum that are empowered by not seeking a solution, but are empowered to keep the problem alive and to keep it as contentious and as disruptive as it is for political purposes, rather than trying to say, this is a challenge out there that's affecting American society, let's find a way to address it and then move on to the next one, because we've got a long list of them.
A lot of things happening. Yeah, the whole concept of checks and balances, right? I mean, now that at one point it was questioned, as recent as last year, right? Because especially with the Supreme Court going the way it went, we had everything sort of the checks and balances were sort of in out of balance, so to say.
And you continue to see Senator McConnell, the Republican Majority Leader, erode various procedural structures put in place in the United States Senate to ensure that a minority party has a voice. And we've watched him chip away at them from the first time that he was elevated to that office as a majority leader. And he'll point to the fact that Harry Reid Democrats did some of that when they were in charge, and I would make a pretty strong distinction between what Senator Reid did when he was there and the context around which some of those decisions were made, and the way in which Mr. McConnell has handled that responsibility and the decisions that he has made and the way that in which he's gone about it. And it has been essentially a prime example of the acquisition and maintenance of power at all costs, and without regards to that impact and long-term impact, what it does to our democratic structures, institution, and country, where you have a sizable percentage of our country, sometimes over 50%, that disagree with the policies being put forth by some of those folks that are still in a position to implement that policy.
Yeah, that's it's a very challenging work that you have set out for you in DC.
All of us.
All of you.
us.
Yeah. So tying again to what something you've said earlier about how long it takes to get things done in DC for one reason or another, I wanted to tie into immigration. We mentioned a couple of times, immigration is a loaded topic. I had attorneys speaking on the show a couple of times on immigration issues because there's just so much to cover and there are so many different aspects. I wanted to ask you about specifically about the path to citizenship issue, because there's a lot happening south of the border and it's on the news a lot of times, but we haven't really heard much about what's happening on that front. DACA has sort of issues with that, has calmed down. For now. But in terms of all, the millions of people who are here have been here lived here for many, many years and without papers, undocumented. Is there any hope? Is there anything happening? Is there any hope for those individuals?
So, look, I think there's always hope.
There's always hope. Hope maybe that's the wrong word to use.
Look, I think when it comes to immigration, happens to be arguably, if not the hardest issue that Congress is confronting, certainly one of the top 2 or 3. And you've got some folks that are very dug in on a very conservative vision of it. I would remind people, though, that say that this is something where the American public is largely spread out across a political spectrum, and there's no consensus around this. That back in 2013, shortly after I got elected, the United States Senate passed a comprehensive immigration reform bill put forward by Marco Rubio, Jeff Flake, John McCain, along with Michael Bennet, Chuck Schumer, a couple of others. That was this extraordinary coalition of progressives and conservative members of the Senate that passed the Senate with a veto-proof majority. That bill was endorsed by the President of the United States. We were in the minority in the House. Democrats could not force the bill to the floor for a vote. But the folks leading that effort in the House of Representatives did a count, and we had the votes to pass it. And so we actually had the votes to pass a comprehensive fixed-term immigration system, put together a way that folks earned their way to citizenship. Nobody got it passed, but was a reflection of the reality that with 11+ million people in our country without proper documentation, that even conservatives haven't come up with a viable pathway or a viable system to address those individuals, because we in this country, I think, believe that we should not have people living in the shadows in a 2-tier system of democracy in our nation. And so where people pay a fine, went to the back of the line, and earned their way there over a series of years. We had the votes to pass that. Speaker John Boehner, catering to a right flank, the most conservative folks in the Conservative Party, decided not to put that on the floor. We had a chance to do something more for DACA. We had the votes to pass that last year as well. Same problem, same issue. New Speaker Paul Ryan, decided not to put that bill on the floor to cater to an ultra-conservative right flank. A government shutdown that happened back in December. Speaking to a very senior Republican senator who said to me, shortly after the government shutdown, I ran into him in a coffee shop in DC, and he said, these issues that we are wrestling with today are the same issues that I worked on with your uncle 20 years ago, trying to find a way to address basic structures in the immigration system. We have had the chance to solve this, and politics and choices by political leaders have ensured that we haven't. At a certain point, we are going to have to solve it. And I would hope that as the president continues to inflame this issue for purely political purposes, without actually addressing the underlying issues that are forcing people to flee Central America, and yes, asking questions as to why, after they're fleeing largely 3 nations in what's called the Northern Triangle, Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador, and why they are coming here. And yes, we can look at the laws and the structures of our own society here as part of that discussion, but any discussion around how you're going to address humanitarian issues on our border, you're not going to do that until you address issues in Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador. And our President Trump, has decided to, rather than actually try to address the underlying structures there, to cut aid, use extremely harsh rhetoric, and essentially incentivize more people to come here while bashing the people as they come, to keep this cycle going for pure political exploitation rather than actually solving the substance of it. And as long as that happens, we're in a tough spot. Hopefully, responsible members of the Republican Party will step forward and say, hey, let's actually solve this for the good of our nation, good of our partners all around the world, and for the men and women and children that are caught in the middle of this. Stop playing politics with their lives. Yeah,
because if I remember, there are no new applications for DACA protection, right?
No.
Yeah, so we're back to where we were many years ago.
Yes, and there's pending court cases, and so this is the threat. The immediate threat on DACA has subsided, although it is still a top priority for many of us in Congress to try to find a way to resolve it, so that you've got folks, as you indicated, that have been here for years, that are not part of a driving challenge with our immigration system. We also have, representing communities in the suburbs of Boston, you've got an awful lot of firms that need access to talent, can't hire people. There's jobs that are going unfulfilled. There's the comprehensive immigration bill that we dealt with in 2013 was estimated to provide such a boom to our economy that we took the tax revenue from it and actually put that into a surge of Border Patrol agents down on the southern border that was completely and totally paid for by the additional revenue. And so you look at the system at the moment, it's harming our businesses, it's certainly harming our communities, it's harming our country, and it is playing politics with people that are desperate for some semblance of stability. It's not reflective of our values, it's not reflective of our interests, and it's not making our country stronger.
And the people are already here. So it's not like they're not going to leave only because we have not done anything if they haven't left already.
The idea of self-deportation, as plenty of conservatives would tell you, just does not work.
So one of the, I think that probably looking at the time, the last thing that we can cover today is I wanted to talk about access to justice issues. One of the things that a lot of people have issues with accessing the legal system for many reasons. Usually, sometimes people say transportation, language. I think mostly it is cost. In Massachusetts, in Bristol County, and I think most of Massachusetts, in family courts, I think around 70% of individuals come to court without legal representation. And this is family court, where you're talking about really important issues. Not that other legal issues are not important, but these are issues that really impact people's families, the most important thing in people's life, one could say. And so I'm curious, from your point of view, why do you think I know you're involved in access to justice at DC. I think there is a committee that you are on. And why do you think we have this crisis now? Why, it's not just Massachusetts, it's not just Bristol County, it's all across the United States. I believe most of the states have some kind of commission or task force established. But why do you think it is now, versus 20 years ago, 30 years ago?
So I think the challenge has existed for an awfully long time. I think what we've also seen is, one, a greater awareness of it, two, the fact that as, where I firstly came to view it was as a law student working in a legal aid organization in the midst of a foreclosure crisis, where you had families that didn't do anything wrong, folks that were renting homes and apartments when the person that owned the home then defaulted on the loan, and you had folks that were paying the rent the whole time, and they were then, and their families out on the street and didn't do anything wrong, and were trying to figure out how to pick up and with kids in school and trying to keep a roof over your head on very short notice, and we're stunned because they hadn't done anything. And so for the folks that were able to access a lawyer, yes, some of us we could provide some sort of assistance, but for everyone that we did, there were so many more that didn't and that couldn't. And when I was a prosecutor then coming out of shortly after graduating law school, it always struck me, I did a lot of domestic violence work in domestic violence prosecution. I could conduct an arraignment when somebody comes in and gets charged with assault and battery on, and I would then sit down, and somebody would move the victim, alleged victim at that point, would move for a restraining order, and there was no legal representation to support her, oftentimes her. while sometimes a defense attorney would sit there and cross-examine her, trying to ask very tough questions to try to make the case as to why that restraining order shouldn't go in place. And there's nothing you could do. And so it sparked in me this recognition that we have enshrined in our Constitution protections for, in criminal cases, a right to an attorney. Most folks know those as the Miranda rights when you see those on those cop shows after people get arrested. You got a right to an attorney, which is mostly true for all serious criminal cases. That's true, even at the state level. But you can have just as serious legal consequences on issues like housing, on issues like domestic violence, where your future, your security, your well-being is going to be put at risk, sometimes because of a mistake somebody else made, and yet you're going to be forced to navigate through the system completely and totally alone. And what the data shows is that for those folks that do have access to a lawyer, not just and their results become much, much better because you're dealing with a professional that knows how to navigate that system, but the cases speed up. Everybody ends up, the whole process works better because of the complexities of our legal system, when you have lawyers and a judge that can navigate through it, rather than somebody that has absolutely no legal training trying to figure out how they're going to try a family law case, right, or defend themselves through it. I've been in court. I remember going through a trial with somebody that was defending himself, and it's particularly challenging. An individual, not unreasonably, but doesn't know any of the rules of evidence, doesn't know any of the basic structures of how a trial or legal system is supposed to work, and it's extremely frustrating. It bogs the whole process down. And so there's been a growing awareness in Congress across the aisle, across the political spectrum, that this is not about, it is an anti-poverty program, of course, but it's so much more than that. It's about making sure that we as a country make good on the fundamental promise that everyone is seen, everyone counts, and that we have equal justice under law. And that's supposed to be what our country stands for.
Do you think there is any solution that can to that issue? Because I mean, there's only so many hours that lawyers can do of pro bono work, right? Is maybe technology an issue? Is some states they're trying to be innovative by licensing paralegals or other sort of paraprofessionals, legal professionals, by letting them do certain tasks. So I'm just trying to think.
So there's a lot of different ways to look at it. So one, technology certainly can be an issue. You can imagine outside a courtroom having a kiosk in multiple different languages where you could do a touch screen to try to at least come up with a rudimentary, as they called, answer and counterclaims or file some documents that are not in legalese but would help somebody, empower a defendant to be able to navigate a system or a respondent to navigate a system in a certain way that at the moment doesn't exist. So technology certainly can help. Technology and telecommuting and stuff that would help as well. Two, empowering paralegals to do some of that legal work potentially can help. Also retirees, people that had practiced law, maybe a different type of law, but have some time now, particularly as baby boomers age and many of those lawyers retire. Are there ways to leverage some of that, their time and capacity and expertise to help out? Three, funding through Legal Services Corporation, increasing the funding that for the basic field grants. The number's now a little old, and we're doing our best to up the funding for it. But back in 2014, we as a society spent more money on Halloween costumes for our pets than we spent on basic field grants for legal services.
Wow.
So
what do you say to that, right?
We got off the funding.
I have nothing to say to that.
So there's between leveraging excess capacity that some folks with legal training, whether that be paralegals or retirees, trying to leverage technology, trying to lean on major law firms, some of which, yes, do some pro bono work. Oftentimes those end up being very complex cases. There's less of that ends up going into kind of the mass amounts of cases when it comes to eviction or family law, where a lot of folks are. So leaning on other providers of legal services to try to, legal support to try to meet that burden as well.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for your time. I think we are out of time, so unfortunately we could talk and talk. There is more to cover, but I think we're going to have to wrap it up.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you everyone for watching.